telling the truth during wartime could never be aid and comfort to the enemy.
That was Professor Herman David Black, who was part of the furniture at the University of Sydney for over 60 years. Beginning as an economics student in the 1920s, Black rose through the ranks at the university, from junior lecturer in the 1930s all the way to Chancellor of the university in the 1970s, a position he held until his death in 1990. Black was there for pretty much all the university's ups and downs during the 20th century, like World War II, the university's post-war expansion, and the student protests of the 1970s. Luckily for us, he was interviewed extensively for the University History Project in the 1980s. He discussed everything from student fashion of the 1930s, his time as a professor of economics, and the evolution of the university from a small campus into the large, sprawling place we know today. I'm historian and budding archivist, Dr. Gab Kemmis, and this is an episode of Speaking of History, a podcast which explores stories hidden within the recently digitised cassette tapes of interviews conducted in the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s with former University of Sydney staff and students. Today, we'll be listening to a couple of Black's anecdotes about censorship in Australia during World War II. The stories come from his first interview with historians Donald Wood and Ursula Bigott on the 3rd of November, 1981. Herman David Black was born in Dulwich Hill in Sydney's inner west in 1904. Coming from fairly humble origins, he was fortunate enough to receive a Sydney Teachers College scholarship, which he utilised to study a Bachelor of Economics, graduating in 1927. A clever and sociable young man, Black excelled in the university environment. In fact, he was offered a job as a lecturer while still a student in 1933. He took the job and while lecturing went on to complete his Master of Economics in 1937. Despite what you might think, Black was not always well behaved in class. Take a listen to him recalling the first time he met Professor of Literature, Mungo McCallum.
I had my first contact with Mungo in a personal sense as a lecturer from whom I took lectures in the history of the drama up to, but not including, the Elizabethan era, which were given to honour students in English, and for which he had in fact prepared a printed, not just a roneoed, a printed synopsis, which is again the mark of a very scholarly and careful teacher, that he gave his students such an aid. I had the honour, of course, also of being thrown out of his class for some misdemeanour of talking during his lectures, and being called back by him and admonished that it was not the thing to do, because that was precisely what he used to do as a student.
Given Black's confidence and knack for making friends easily, one imagines he was kicked out of class for talking excessively and not paying attention to the lecture. A common experience for many of us, of course. Black's voice was perfect for public speaking. You won't be surprised then to learn that he was also a radio broadcaster throughout his academic career, usually providing expert opinion on economics, but also on other topics like politics and international relations. He was a well-known generalist. Black was a regular radio commentator when the Second World War broke out in 1939. Once war was declared, the Australian government, keen to ensure that all public broadcasts supported the nation's war effort and did not negatively affect morale, brought in strict censorship regulations. Black, like many other public broadcasters, was not a fan of these regulations. At the beginning of his interview, in November 1981, Donald Wood asked Black about his recollections of censorship beginning in 1939.
I recall particularly the meeting which was largely called at the instigation of Professor Roberts, and that was that when it was clear that the war was upon us, and when it was also clear that there would be some form of censorship imposed on the media generally, that he took the initiative in securing a meeting with the censor and other commentators such as myself, in order to, if you like, come to some understanding as to what he would do to the kinds of things we would be writing and saying. But most particularly, Roberts wanted to make the point face to face with the censor that after all we were patriotic, loyal citizens of this country, most unlikely to give the enemy aid and comfort.
Despite hearing these passionate declarations of the academics' loyalty to Australia and to the war effort, the Censorship Board heavily regulated the production of all media, including radio broadcasts, during the war.
The censorship that was imposed was, I must say, in retrospect, utterly stupid. The ABC required that all scripts be prepared and submitted in such a situation before and sufficiently in time before their actual broadcast. This meant that they went to some address in Sydney and came back sometimes with a blue pencil or sometimes with a cross out of material. But the extraordinary thing was the sheer stupidity of the actual censoring. In some cases, for example, a piece of material would be stricken out, and then it would be realized that in fact it had already been published in any case and was publicly available. And in other cases, I've even had, when I was broadcasting, a censor enter the room and, leaning over my shoulder, cross out a piece which he thought was likely to bring about our defeat in the war.
Not to be dissuaded, and determined to make sure the Australian public were provided as much information as possible about the war, Black and his colleague, historian Stephen Roberts, devised a plan to evade the censors while still following the law.
Both Roberts and I developed a technique of defeating the censor by alteration in the emphasis that we put upon what remained, in such a way that you not only spoke what was there, but from our tone and our emphasis you could infer what was not there. And this was something immensely irritating to the censor, and was a trick which we used over and over again. The best illustration I can give you is that with the change of the government from that led by Mr. Menzies to that led by Mr. Curtin, and with the entry of Japan into the war, the Australian government determined that in the commentaries that were given over the broadcast system in Australia, that primacy of interest would be given to and emphasis would be placed on the importance of the Pacific Theatre, even though it was quite clear that the basic strategy of the Allies was to defeat Hitler in Europe first and then ultimately to defeat the Japanese in the Pacific. The Australian Labor Party at the time wanted a continuous emphasis upon the Pacific Theatre, as if what was happening in Gona or in Leh would of course bring about the ultimate defeat of the Germans in Russia, which was of course utter nonsense, but here it was. They wanted this emphasis. Now both Roberts and I knew that this was strategic nonsense, and by virtue of writing your script and most importantly reading it in such a way that the little bit of information about Europe that you put in got such a treatment slowly and deliberately that you made your point and the listener couldn't but realize that what was being said is, this is the important bit concerning Europe at the moment, and this is the other bit concerning the Pacific. And so the censor was, as usual, stupid, and furthermore, he was quite capable of being avoided, and Roberts and I used to enjoy doing it just that way.
Conveying the truth to the Australian public was of utmost importance to Black, and by the sounds of it, he took great pride in keeping the public with up-to-date information about the war. Having Black's frank recollections about censorship during World War II is an oral history gem. We get to hear Black's story and also hear the frustrations in his voice that enable us to more fully understand how difficult being a broadcaster during the war must have been. It points to tensions on the home front that would be quite interesting to explore further. We've only listened to a small snippet of Black's many interviews, so there is much more to listen to and much more we could learn from them. You can listen to the interviews now via the University of Sydney Archive's new online platform, Recollect. The sound quality of these tapes can vary, and we have done our best to make them as audible as possible. The Speaking of History podcast series is part of the History of University Life program. You can find out about our events by heading over to the History of University Life on Twitter handle @HUL Seminar. The podcast is supported by the School of Humanities in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney, with technical production by Peter Adams. This podcast was recorded on Gadigal country, and we pay our respects to elders past and present.